My name is Michael Penn, teach in the Stanford Religious Studies Department, and I want to welcome you to the fourth of 5 Ptarmigan mini lectures taking place during the first half of 21. The series showcases senior as well as exceptional junior faculty, but instead of delivering a traditional research presentation, we've asked participants to use the classroom lecture as their model. We've allocated exactly 1 hour for this, and so as a result, I'm going to give an incredibly brief speaker introduction, but most importantly, during the presentation, please take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Anuja Amin, one of our department's PhD students who has overseen this series, will curate submitted questions and present them to our speaker. Now on to tonight's speaker. Ellen Muehlberger is professor of Christianity and Late Antiquity at the University of Michigan. She is the author of Angels in Late Ancient Christianity and Moment of Reckoning, Image, Death, and Its Consequences in Late Ancient Christianity, as well as the recipient of many awards, including an NEH and an ACLS Rice Count Fellowship. Tonight, she'll be speaking to us about rhetoric.
Welcome, everyone. I have a slideshow that you'll be looking at while I'm talking. Thank you, first off, both to Michael Penn and to Anuja Amin for inviting me and shepherding me through the process of joining you tonight. I appreciate you taking time at the end of your day to listen to this lecture. So tonight we're going to be talking about rhetorical education in late antiquity. And you'll probably gather that this is a favorite topic of mine. It's something that I think there are many misconceptions about, and it's something that I really can talk about in great detail. So if at the end of the lecture you have more questions, even after the Q&A, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. You can pretty much easily find me on Google and find my email address. I'm happy to take questions and or talk more about your research or your interests. So when I say the word rhetoric, there are several connotations in current discourse and how we talk about rhetoric. One of them is that it's fake, that we don't really mean what we say when we use rhetoric, that it's false or it's something put on, or you'll hear somebody say, oh, he asked a rhetorical question, meaning he didn't actually ask the question. He wasn't interested in an answer. It was just sort of a posing mechanism. That might be one connotation when you hear the word rhetoric or you hear people talk about rhetoric. Another one is that rhetoric is designed to control you, meaning if I use the right combination of words or the right emotional persuasion, I might be able to change your mind about things. And even though right now we're talking about modern connotations, this is a concern about rhetoric that has been present even as early as classical Athens. So A.A. Long, in a book called Greek Models of the Mind and Self, I think that's the right title, discussed how in classical Athens, politicians would use speech forms that others would call rhetoric, and those others would critique the speech forms for being too persuasive or too even invasive to the listeners. So the idea was, rhetoric would get in your ear and perhaps even physically start to change how you think. It might imprint upon yourself. And Long points out that this is one of the starting points for Greek philosophers and Greek philosophical discourse for thinking about something called the soul. We think, there's the soul. Of course, that's the interior part of a human being. But Long argues that the idea that there is a soul comes from trying to hold off the controlling or the invasive format of rhetoric, so that you could have something inside yourself that was untouched by wily words or really, really persuasive speech that was designed to make you do things or make you think things. We have this kind of connotation as well in the modern world. We think, oh, well, he's going to say something the right way, and then he's going to have people think just like he thinks. The other connotation that we have about rhetoric is that it's decorative, meaning it's not really substantial. It's there to be the surface, it's the frosting on the cupcake, but what you really want is the cupcake, or that it is something that doesn't really contribute to the content of what's being said. And that's an important thing to notice, that when we think about rhetoric as, oh, it's just the filigrees that you put on afterwards, what you're saying is that there's something central or essential to the message you're giving, and then you put the decoration on it. There's a kernel in the middle, and then there's the fluffy stuff that you put on the outside so people will hear it a certain way, or so that people will believe you in a certain way. All of those connotations are negative. They're dismissive of rhetoric. And part of my goal tonight is to convince you that at least for late antiquity, which I'll just put boundaries on it between 300 and 700 CE, that is the Common Era, at least for late antiquity, rhetoric was not false or fake or simply controlling or simply decorative. It was instead a foundational form of not just writing and speaking, but also of thinking. It was culturally central to the way that Greek and Latin writers, but also Syriac and Coptic writers, people around the ancient Mediterranean, communicated with one another and thought about their world. So I'm going to take you through three sections tonight. So we have three topics that we're going to cover. The first is the actual curriculum itself. I'm going to describe to you the basics of what the rhetorical curriculum was and how it was taught. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how it was used in late ancient culture, particularly the late ancient Mediterranean. And then, because I'm a historian of early Christianity, I'm constantly presented with this question. Aren't rhetoric, especially if you think of rhetoric as something that isn't connected to Christianity and is taught by people who aren't Christians, aren't rhetoric and Christianity separate things? Aren't they at odds, and shouldn't they be separated? That is a constant question among historians in my field, and asking it assumes that these two things are quite separate. You can probably guess from my demeanor that I'm going to say, no, these things are not enemies. And in fact, they work together and they're co-generative of what we think of as Christian literature and Christian theology. But I'll give you more detail when I get to that section. At the end, I'm going to give you a short bibliography. And I emphasize the word short. I really could offer a lot more resources. So if this talk wets your whistle for more, please do not hesitate to ask. All right, so the first section of our talk is about the rhetorical curriculum itself. Now, education in antiquity and late antiquity was structured around working with texts. And that doesn't mean just writing texts, but it also means doing things like memorizing them, learning how to read them. Well, actually, even on a basic level, learning how to read them, recognizing letters and words, but then also working with them in a way by memorizing them, by imitating them, and by eventually writing them yourselves. Teachers of rhetoric used a set of exercises, and you see the fancy word on the slide, progymnosmata, which is a plural word in Greek that means the things that come before you get to the work or to the effort. You see the word gymnasium in there. So they're the things you do before you get to the gym in a certain way, or we could call them warm-ups. In different schools, there were, between 10 and 12, maybe a dozen progymnosmata or warm-up exercises that you learned how to do. And some of them are probably going to be entirely familiar to you because we still have them now. That is, we still use them and we still talk about them even with their same names. So some of the ones that might be familiar to you, you might know what narrative is. Like if I said to you, could you write a narrative of your afternoon in the hour before you came to this talk? You would know what you'd be saying. Well, I did this thing, and then I did this thing, and then I saw this person, and they said, and I was expecting this, but it didn't happen. So we have like a, 1, 2, 3, one thing after another way of telling a narrative. You, if you've ever written a paper in an academic setting, have probably written a thesis or a proposition, meaning you've argued a point, and one of the progymnosmata is to argue a thesis and support it with both persuasion and evidence. You might have at some point done a comparison. And that could be as simple as, you're choosing between two jobs, or you've been formally assigned an academic assignment that says, please compare and contrast these two things. Comparison is a basic exercise that we do all the time when we're thinking or writing. So these are some of the friends among the dozen or so warm-up exercises in the rhetorical curriculum that you probably already recognize. Now, some of them are a little more specialized or you probably need a little more contact with the ancient world, but you might have heard of these. So one of them, it has a fancy name, ekphrasis, but we can also call it description. This exercise is practice in physically describing your representing your environment or an environment to someone else. So ekphrasis is something that historians use a lot, especially historians of art or historians of material objects, because ancient writers practiced it and oftentimes described in great detail things that no longer survive. So, for example, in the Iliad, Homer describes Achilles' shield, the sort of disc of metal that he carries. That thing doesn't exist, but people try all the time to reconstruct what it would look like. What were the patterns on it that Homer describes? What did they mean? And that's all possible because ekphrasis as an exercise is focused on representing in words a visual tableau or a representative tableau of something that usually you can see. That's not to say it's not sometimes imagined, but it's a transferal of what we might think of as visual representation into textual representation. Another one that you might know is encomium, or if you've heard the English word encomium, a praiseful speech that you give, if you're toasting your buddy who's retiring, or you're giving a speech to honor your teacher. These are the kinds of things where we use that word. Making a praiseful speech was a kind of exercise in the rhetorical curriculum. There's another one that you might not have heard the Greek word for it, pisogos, but you might have heard the English word invective. And this is a frequent exercise or format that gets used in politics. So imagine one politician speaking about her opponent and the kind of words and phrases and accusations is the word I'm looking for there, accusations and charges that she would lobby against someone that she disagreed with politically. That's practiced in the exercise of pisogos or invective. Now, here are some that you may never have heard of, though I can still describe them to you and you probably see, oh yeah, this is a part of writing that even persists today. So one is called crea. And that the English translation for that is usually anecdote or sometimes vignette even, but it often has to be like, here is a person that we all recognize, let's say Iron Man. It can be a character. So I picked Iron Man because Iron Man doesn't actually exist. He is just a character in all of our imaginations. But what would Iron Man say? Oh, well, I saw him the other day and he gave me this following wise phrase. Never use a suit that isn't maroon or red. And you would report Iron Man, I saw him on the street, some little setting, and then you would give his wise phrase. That is the exercise of crea, and memorizing, imitating, and then writing those is how you come up with that sort of thing. So you're asked to imagine what a well-known or wise person would say, and then you relate that in third person. You tell the story about them. Another one next is topos, which I know is a word in English, but this in Greek actually it means place, but we might describe it as commonplace. It's a common place to think, oh, the grocer is going to be a jovial person who sells me fruit and then wishes me well and asks after my kids and then sends me on my way after I pay him. Topos can also be, in a negative sense, a matter of stereotyping. So writing a topos is describing someone according to some characteristic or some identity that they inhabit and the qualities that usually follow that identity. That's a kind of practice that people did. There are two other words that are even longer words on a scale way, which is, it is a way of, I'm trying to think of how to, it's turning back, it's refutation, and specifically the way to refute someone else's story or ideas. And then the last one, ironically, it's the longest word here. And I have to tell you, I once won here in Washtenaw County where I live, I once won an adult spelling bee on this word. This was the final word. And prosopopoeia is how you say it. There's a lot of P's in the word, but it translates to something like speech in character. And it is the process of writing a speech for a character, but doing it in first person. So if I were to say, gosh, what would, I don't know, Serena Williams say when she wins her 100,000th match? And then I imagine a first person speech and I inhabit the person of Serena Williams. That is the exercise of prosopopoeia. And so you look at this set of exercises. There are a few others, but these are the ones that I thought you might be familiar with, or you might have heard of, or some that are illustrative, but you might not have heard of them. these exercises formed the backbone of a curriculum of education where young men, usually mostly men, would learn how to write in the different forms. So part of that learning, I'm going to skip forward to, forgive me, my animation is not exactly working. Let's see. Yes, part of that learning was practicing over and over again. So when we think about learning new things, oftentimes, you might be sitting in a college classroom and you're learning chemistry for the first time. Part of what you have to do is you have to memorize a bunch of different reactions or a bunch of different equations for how things work if you're in a mathematical classroom. And similarly, in the rhetorical curriculum, one of the first things that you did with a teacher was memorize a whole lot of models for each of these exercises. Because, you don't know how to write a Pasogos when you're just starting out. You don't know how to write, say, an encomium for someone else, but you can watch as other people do it. And by watch, I mean you can read the greats and the important authors and look at their best models for what they were trying to accomplish with each form, and then start to internalize them by memorization. After memorization, normally students would then also do performance, meaning all of these are formats that lend themselves to being spoken aloud. And so you would perform these, but part of performance was making them convincing. So if you were trying to say, do an invective, you couldn't deliver it like, well, I think that probably my opponent is not very good and I don't really like her. You would have to embody the invective. She has lied over and over, and bodily motions, your diction, even the way that you breathe or take in breath to say your words, the emotions that you convey would be part of that imitation. And you can imagine, like if these are, let's say 13, 14-year-old kids, you can imagine that the first couple of times you try to imitate, say, an invective, watching a 13-year-old take on a fellow politician for all of his crimes, it's hard to watch and take seriously. But part of the curriculum recognized that, well, you had to practice. You had to be able to inhabit it. And the only way to try to inhabit that kind of speech was to do it over and over and again, and to convince your audience and yourself that you could inhabit whatever voice it was that you had memorized and you were trying to perform. Then you would also start to compose your own. And oftentimes your teacher would give you an imagined exercise. So in the case of topos, it might say, your teacher might say, okay, describe for me the qualities of a farmer. And then you would write up, not borrowing from the things that you had learned before, but modeling yourself on the things you had learned before, examples of topos. And you would then write the description of what a farmer was like. And then your teacher and possibly your fellow students would critique you. Yes, this is good. No, this seems too generalizing. This seems too specific. So you would get iterated feedback on multiple rounds of attempts, meaning you would practice. So that kind of learning, one of the questions that people have about it is, well, it sounds really boring to memorize somebody else's speeches, somebody else's models for all of these things, and to have these very specific, there are these 11 exercises and you learn how to do them and there's a certain way to do each one. It sounds, well, boring and flat, and sometimes, especially a word that people use with memorization techniques, rote. And I want to point out to you that this system of learning, when we take it on for ourselves or when we see it in our culture, we don't think of it as anything like flat or rote. I have two examples to prove this to you. So if the progymnosmata and what I've just described to you sounds like, oh, that's just so boring and so uninventive and not useful for the student, I want to suggest to you that this kind of learning system is something that we use when we want to produce people who are naturals, who at the peak of their performance just seem like they are doing things absolutely effortlessly. But of course, those things are built on years and years of imitation, modeling, practicing, trying and getting corrected, trying again and getting corrected, trying again and getting corrected. So my two examples are, first, our friend Megan Rapinoe. If you do not know this woman, she is a US women's soccer player. This is the stance that she makes after she scores a goal. She is an absolute delight of a human being. And if you look her up on YouTube, you will recognize that she is an amazingly talented soccer player and scorer. She often, if you play soccer, she often scores from outside the penalty area. And I don't mean the penalty box near the goal, but the penalty area, the huge area. You know, she'll just tap things in or send things on. I have a GIF of her doing a corner kick, and I want to show this to you because I want to see your reaction. This is when she was with the Seattle Reign. So here she is. The GIF will have to replay for a moment, but you'll see her over in the corner. She says, I'm taking the kick. She takes the kick, lofts the ball, and floof, there it goes into the corner. Now, you look at that and you think, that's a person who's naturally talented. Of course, she does this all the time. Megan Rapinoe has probably done thousands, and I mean thousands of corner kick drills in her life. You don't get to be that natural unless you practice. And nobody looks at this or any of the other goals that she scores and says, oh, well, that's kind of boring. She's just doing a drill that she's done since she was like 11 or whatever. Oh, look, she's doing a passing drill. Oh, she's doing a dribbling drill. Oh, she got past that defender. Oh, she just kicked it into the goal like she's practiced thousands of times. No, no, no. You look at her and you think, this is an amazing soccer player. Second example, Misty Copeland, who is with the American Ballet Theater. Here she is looking exactly as a ballerina should. You know, she's excellently beautiful. Her extension of her leg, her arms, the position of her hands, they're all perfect. If you watch, I'm going to show you a GIF of her in motion. Watch this GIF. You can take that apart and you can see each of the little ballerina exercises that many of us, I took ballet when I was 5 or whatever, did in ballet class. I am not Misty Copeland, oh my goodness. But I learned how to carry my arms. I learned how to extend my foot. If you look at the leg of hers that's towards us and extending back for her, she is entirely turned out at the hip. I learned how to do that, not very well, mind you, and I didn't continue. But what she's doing here is the result of years of repetitive, rote, memorized, and iteratively corrected practice. We produce virtuosi, jazz musicians, any kind of musician, talented speakers, people who do things that look natural did not get there naturally. They got there by a system of practice that is much like the rhetorical curriculum. In late antiquity, that curriculum was both beneficial to the people who studied in it, especially if they were good at it, and it created a common culture for people to work together, especially in what we might think of as bureaucratic or speaking-based jobs. So the career preparation angle first is this. In order to really do any kind of work that involves speaking or writing, the way that you learned how to speak and write was to do this curriculum, which meant that you had a common culture with anybody else doing that kind of work. It's a bit like having a bachelor's degree in our culture. So, you may have a bachelor's degree in something that you have nothing to do with now. You might have gotten one in econ and now you're a real estate agent. I guess those are related, but not exactly. Or you might have gotten one in mathematics and maybe you are at the seminary studying to be a rabbi. Those are indications that a bachelor's degree establishes for us some kind of common culture. It doesn't even sort of matter what your major is, but our culture makes a distinction between people who went to college and people who didn't, because college is establishing that kind of common culture for people. It exposes you to new things. It suggests to people who are going to work with you later that you have tried to learn something. It socializes you. It makes networks for you. So there's a reason why having a bachelor's degree is something that people look to as a method of social mobility. The rhetorical curriculum and mastering it was also a method of social mobility because it opened to you all kinds of not just imperial jobs, but other kinds of bureaucratic jobs, city-based, province-based jobs. It was also a thing that in the period of late antiquity, between 300 and 700, was extremely popular and dispersed. This is a little bit different than what we know of rhetoric before, say, about the year 300. And by that I mean this. So before about the year 300, we know that there are teachers who are using some kind of system. They mention it in some of their treatises, and they talk about their theories for developing students. They talk about what the different exercises might do. They even name some of the exercises. But in late antiquity, there started to be a kind of textbook phenomenon, meaning people started to make handbooks of how to teach the rhetorical curriculum. And that was more than just, oh, well, there's this important orator who has shared with me that he teaches his students the following thing. These were portable guides for how to enact this curriculum with different people. And we have them from lots of different sources. They exist in both Greek and Latin, and were compiled in both Greek and Latin, and then immediately, very quickly translated into languages like Syriac. So we know they're popular. They survive in a number of different, under a number of different authors' names, some of them very clearly pseudepigraphal, that is attributed to people who didn't write them. But what that means is that rhetorical education was dispersed in a way that the record that survives to us suggests it wasn't before the period of late antiquity. When you have that kind of dispersion, you often are also making connections for people. So let's say that you live in a city in the Eastern Mediterranean, and you go and you try to study with the most important teacher in your town. Not only are you getting, what everybody around you sees as your important education or your important, not degree, but the equivalent of your important degree from your important school, you're also meeting everybody else in that classroom. And across different cities, we know of people being connected from having been in these classrooms together, having studied with the same teacher. So there are lateral connections being made when you work with a particular teacher, which means you already have a set of connections when you go out into the world and you start building your own career. It actually, this really tracks with the example of having a college degree. We know too that from both documentary evidence and literary evidence that the rhetorical curriculum was the basis of writing for most people in the late ancient Mediterranean. So by looking at the way that people structure speeches, or the different kind of formats that they use to write histories, or even the ways that they write letters, we can pick out and see, oh, look, there's the form of invective. Or, oh, look, in this letter, he tells a story in a way that matches the expectations, the formal expectations of an exercise like narrative. So the exercises don't remain just little warm-up exercises. They end up being the building blocks of the literature that we have from late antiquity. And we can see in different authors, not just Greek and Latin authors, but others as well, that they knew these forms. And the way to know them is either to have studied them formally, or if you're a really smart person, I guess you could have picked them up from reading other people's work. But really the only way to end up learning how to write like this was to go through this curriculum. Now, when we think about the role of rhetoric in late antiquity, oftentimes the question comes up, and especially in the work that I do, of whether it's opposed to Christianity or whether Christianity is something that's separate from rhetoric, especially because most teachers of rhetoric were not Christian. Some possibly were, but most of them were not. And most of the examples that get used for these rhetorical exercises tend not to be from Christian stories. They tend to be from non-Christian stories. So for example, the ekphrasis that's in the Iliad of Achilles' shield, or in the case of something like speech and character, you could ask, well, what is it that Medea would say just before she kills her children, right? Like these are all examples that are common within non-Christian literature, classical Greek and classical Latin literature. There are some examples of the exercises being done with Christian sources. So we have a few examples of, say, for example, a speech and character that's like, well, what did Cain say as he was carrying the dead body of his brother? And then there's a little speech that's in Cain's voice saying, oh, I've killed him and now I regret it, that sort of thing. But the majority of the rhetorical classrooms depended on the use of content from non-Christian stories. And so because of something I'm about to tell you about, that puts rhetoric perhaps at odds with Christianity. And here's the event that sort of, not the event, here's the theme that exists within Christianity that makes you think perhaps rhetoric and Christianity are enemies. And that is this: Christians, when they wrote about non-Christian literature, which they called outside literature, thought of it as immoral, as not using good examples. They looked at stories of, say, gods who came to the earth and would say rape a woman, or gods who would steal from one another, gods who would punish someone unjustly, and say, well, this is not really a good example. And we Christians, now I'm going to do a speech in character as a Christian, we Christians have literature that actually upholds values like truth and justice. So we shouldn't read that outside literature. This problem of what should Christians read was a part of early Christianity more or less from the beginning, but it came to a head in the latter part of the 4th century. That is because an emperor named Julian made a pronouncement that Christians should not be teaching in this kind of curriculum, not just the rhetorical curriculum, but other throughout the educational system. And it was unclear, and people debate whether he meant, is it just that Christians shouldn't be teaching, or is it that they shouldn't be teaching Christian material? Does Christian material fit in the rhetorical curriculum? Does it not? And that pronouncement from the Emperor Julian really made this problem more pitched. It gave it a sort of harder edge, such that Christians did one of two things. Either people like Basil of Caesarea or Gregory of Nazianzus or Gregory of Nyssa started to make apologetic cases for reading outside literature. Like, it's okay to read that. You read it and you look at it and you don't get inspired by the god who rapes the human woman. You just read it for understanding the literature and understanding literary forms and for understanding rhetoric. Or Christians started to say very, very negative things about outside literature and got even harder against it. That problem resides on the level of literature, but oftentimes historians of this period will look at it and say, oh, well, Christianity was fully separate from this other culture, which they'll call pagan. So Christians and pagans were really, really separate. And part of what looking at the rhetorical curriculum and the educational system reveals is that Christianity and its cultural pieces were not quite all that different from pagan or from non-Christian, what's the word I want to look for, forms or formats, including in education. So here's an example. I'm going to give you an example of someone making a distinction between Christian discipline and Christian learning and rhetorical learning or rhetorical discipline. His name is Augustine. You may have heard of him. He has a book called Confessions. And in Confessions 113, he gives this little passage. He's talking about when he himself was in a rhetorical classroom. He eventually became a rhetorical teacher after this, but he's talking about his time as a young man. And one of the most well-used ways to do something like speech and character was to take, especially a woman character like Medea or like Dido, who's a character from the Aeneid, and to ask the student, who's usually a man, to imitate her in giving a first-person speech about her situation. So Dido, if you know the story of the Aeneid, Dido is in love with someone, and their relationship truly doesn't work out, and she is about to commit suicide. And the idea is you're supposed to imagine what is it she would say just before she kills herself. And Augustine is complaining about having been forced as a child to make up these kinds of speeches. So he says in Confessions, I learned to lament the death of Dido, who killed herself for love, while all the time in the midst of these things, I was dying, separated from you, my God and my life, and I shed no tears for my own plight. What can be more pitiful than an unhappy wretch, that is Augustine, unaware of his own sorry state, bewailing the fate of Dido, who died for the love of Aeneas, yet shedding no tears for himself, as he dies for want of loving you. Here now, Augustine is looking back at his childhood education and thinking, how fake was that? That was just, I was making stuff up to cry about some woman in some story when I should have been aware that I was dying. I was literally dying, not fake dying, but literally dying because I didn't know. He's addressing in this passage God in the second person, you, God. So Augustine makes this big distinction between the education he got in rhetoric and the kind of discipline or education he should have gotten were he a Christian at that time. Now, mind you, Augustine does this in a huge, long work where he demonstrates knowledge of every rhetorical form in the curriculum. So the very thing that he writes to complain about this dichotomy that to create the dichotomy and complain about it between rhetorical education and Christian education is facilitated by, engendered by his training in that education. And that is the thing that is striking to people. I think that, see, my animation is a little messed up, but I'm on point 2 and I'm moving to point 3. That is the thing that's striking to people, is when you read Christian literature, you see all of the writers that we know. And I think, I mean, outside of people who are doing things like inscriptions or documentary papyri, all of the writers of literature that we know learned by this system, and they were created in this system. So they have these forms as just a normal part of their communication, such that they don't even think of them as forms anymore. It's, thinking back to Misty Copeland. Misty Copeland doesn't think, oh, now I must have the exact correct port de bras, like the arm shape before I do this thing where I raise my arm. She doesn't think about that anymore. She just does it and it looks natural. And all of the Christian writers that we know from late antiquity have those forms at their fingertips, and they're incorporated and assimilated into the way that they speak and write. So that's my point 3. Christians are themselves formed by rhetoric, not just in their literary works, but also in the ways that they make connections with other people. So when they do things like write letters to other people who they need favors from, they write those letters in ways that they've learned in this curriculum. Or when they write letters to scold someone else, they write letters in ways that they have learned using, say, invective or refutation. So what we have in Christian culture, or what we have of Christian culture from late antiquity, is deeply informed, not just decorated, but it deeply informed by this set of pretty elementary, might even say, middle school, early high school writing exercises. And several of the ideas of Christianity, not just Christians themselves, late ancient Christians themselves, but several of the ideas in Christianity are also formed by them. So I'm going to give you one example of this. I wrote a book that Professor Penn made mention of called Moment of Reckoning. It was about how early Christians got in the habit, in the time period that I study, of anticipating the day on which they die and what the experience of death would be like. And the book talked about how anticipating that and imagining it over and over, sometimes daily, really changed Christian ethical stances towards themselves and towards each other. One of the central pieces of that book was showing that when Christians wrote about that moment of death, here's what they did. They would imagine a person on a deathbed, and they would speak in the voice of that person. They would have that person describe their present situation and then turn to their past. And usually, the person on the deathbed is somehow a sinner or somehow somebody who is confronting death in a way that they're regretful of what they've done. So they go back and they look at their past, and they lament what's happened, and they talk about the ways that they've arrived at this moment of death that they are terrified of because they know that some punishment is coming. And then they turn to the future, and still speaking in first person, they will do things like say, well, of course, what's going to happen to me next is even worse. Here are the things that I'm expecting to be punished for, and here are the punishments I expect. That template, that temporal pattern, even, not just the speaking in first person, not just the being emotional, but also the temporal pattern of writing about this moment of death, is in essence formed by the pattern of speech and character that all these men learned when they were 13, 14, 15. So something as abstract and even theological as how do Christians imagine their death and immediate punishment after death or reward after death will be, is grounded in and enabled by this set of rhetorical exercises in this very widespread curriculum. That's it for the lecture part. And now I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can turn to questions.
And on behalf of the audience, because you can't really see anyone,
Thank you.
A phenomenal presentation. And as a second-year PhD student, really kind of brought my attention to an area of discussion that I really didn't even know existed. This is really, really interesting. Okay, so I want to give you a moment. Is there anything else that you maybe wanted to expand on, or do you want to just jump into the Q&A?
I realize that I've left my bibliography off, so maybe at the end I can put the screen back up.
Sure, of course. Yeah, at the end, that would be great.
Okay.
Okay, so I had a lot of thoughts, and I'm going to start off with a few questions that I had. And something that I'm really interested here about is, It's in reference to the training. And when we're talking about rhetorical curriculum, how does it relate to performance? I know you mentioned that like the invective is a very kind of performative action. You speak with confidence. As in high school, I was an LD debater, and I would walk in, and there were days that I had no idea what the case was, but if I said it in the right way, everyone would believe me. And I did win first for that one day. I'm not gonna lie. So I'm really kind of curious the relationship between this curriculum and performance, if there is any.
Absolutely. So part of what you were learning to do was to convincingly perform whatever it was that you needed to do. So something like encomium needed to be presented in a way that suggested you actually did want to praise the person. And the handbooks give us the most detail about this particular part. They both talk about the constitution of a human being as being imprintable. So by practicing over and over again and really feeling it when you practice over and over again, good models of the forms, you're going to imprint on yourself the ability to perform that at different moments. And this is, I think, where people start to think, oh, rhetoric's fake, because you learn how to fake being sincere in praise or being, fiery in invective. But we know, effective speaking, you can be entirely earnest. And if you're flat, then even your earnestness just kind of goes nowhere. But if you're actually earnest, and here I am, Miss Midwestern, like I'm earnest. I'm an earnest person. I'm going to move my hands around. I'm going to emote towards you. I'm a girl, so I'm going to emote in certain ways towards you. But I've learned all those things, and they make a difference in the way that you talk to someone. So the corrections that we know happened have partly to do with, yes, you need to memorize the words, but more of them have to do with, let's think about your body position. Let's think about your tone of voice. Let's think about the words that, even down to like, if say, for example, I needed to do, I'm trying to think of somebody appropriate that everybody here would know. Tell me a character that maybe both Anuj, you and I would know.
What about Superman?
Okay. So Superman is not going to start dropping words like disestablishmentarianism and anarcho-syndicalism, right? Like, so if I'm going to do a speech as Superman, I'm not going to drop those words. I'm going to drop lots of patriotic words and other sorts of things. So even down to word choice, writers had to think about what was going to be convincing. And I don't mean convincing falsely. I mean convincing, at least for late ancient people, they meant it in terms of accuracy and authenticity even. Like, you performing these things was you being authentic.
Okay. And so I do want to kind of run along this, you've opened up like the venue for my next question here. And, part of this curriculum was iterative feedback. That was seen to be huge. So it kind of makes me think, were there separate schools of thought? I know when I think of colleges in America, you might think of, someone who might get a liberal arts education versus a more STEM education. And the type of dialogue that these individuals have are different. So was there a sense of unity across this type of curriculum? That's the core question.
If there was, we don't know. So the best evidence that we have is a series of handbooks. When we get to the bibliography, there's one person who's translated most of them into one nice little volume in English. That series of handbooks suggests that different teachers may have had different approaches, say grouping the exercises together in different ways. So instead of doing, these three together, you might do these three together, or teachers might look at different things as they were correcting. Part of the advice that teachers were given by the handbooks was don't overcorrect, meaning when you're training, let's use Serena Williams again. I mean, actually, we should not use her because she's probably just so naturally talented, but let's use me as a tennis player, right? Like me as a tennis player in 7th grade, you can't correct everything at once. So you have to try, and you watch, a round of tennis playing happen. And then you think, oh, well, I could talk to her about her serve. Just one thing about how she tosses the ball, and that's it. But everything else is wrong too, right? But so teachers were asked to give appropriately small iterations of advice, because otherwise it's just discouraging. And you can't do it all at once. You have to do it over the course of months and years.
Yeah, no, I mean, even though I placed first in LD debate, I was ranked last on the tennis team in high school. So I completely understand what you're saying. Okay. So I'm going to turn to a few audience questions that we have here. Someone has asked, can you suggest regional or linguistic differences among rhetorical practice in late antiquity? Might, for
Ooh.
example, in rhetoric in late ancient Egypt or in Syria differ from rhetoric in more Western contexts?
So I'll take a guess based on what we know, which is to say this: there are not enough resources to answer your question. There are more from Egypt, especially more sort of exercise-based things. Raffaele Cribbiori, who's going to be in this bibliography that I show at the end, has been the person who collects most of those and has published the most on Egyptian documentary exercises, meaning things from people who are actually in school rather than the handbooks. And the differences that you see aren't necessarily regional so much. It's more about the selection of the fodder of the literature that you work on. So from Egypt, we have exercises that are based on Christian literature, like the Cain and Abel one that I suggested. There are exercises based on, Homer and Virgil are big just because they're thought to be common. They're thought to be things that every school kid would know. And in terms of emotional approach, it's hard to put a finger on something that would be different for these different geographical or linguistic boundaries. I'm thinking especially for Syriac, which is something that I've been working in mostly lately. And the main difference that I see is the kind of Syriac writers definitely know how to do most of these forms and do most of these forms, but much of Syriac prose literature is metered. So they're working with not one set of guidelines and restrictions in terms of meeting a form, but two. And so the examples are not quite they don't match exactly what you might see in Greek, but you definitely look at it and you think, oh, there's a person, he knows how to do comparison or syncresis. He knows how to do thesis. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it did. I think it did. It did give a little bit more information in terms of what the question was. And if someone has a follow-up question, please drop it in
Yeah.
the chat and I can definitely ask it again. I did want to take just 1 second, and this is a question for me, and it might be a little bit more basic, but one of the claims that you kind of made was Christianity was deeply formed by like this rhetorical curriculum. I'm, you know, I kind of think of myself in the language that I'm speaking, and that I use rhetorical devices all the time. I use narration, I use anecdote, I mean invectives, maybe not too strongly. I use invectives. How else could Christianity be formed, right? These are kind of the natural ways that language seems to be functioning. So, is there a way to kind of contrast a formation of Christianity without these types of devices? Would it just be flat speech? Again, I'm sorry if this is a little basic.
This is exactly the question. So in the Moment of Reckoning, I have a piece where I say there is no Christian writer that we know of who did not go through this system, who is not formed by the system. In part because the thing that you've just said is so natural to me. Yes, of course, this is how you learn how to write. And if you're writing formally or speaking formally, what you're doing is you've been trained that way. How else in the late ancient world did you get trained that way except by going through one of these systems? But there is a significant part of historiography about early Christianity that suggests, oh, well, this author had this idea, but then adapted it so that non-Christians would hear it. And that's the rhetoric is fake or rhetoric is the frosting approach, as if there is something underneath that exists without the expression in language. So at a certain point, not every person who has this dichotomy viewpoint makes this claim, but at a certain point, that's even a theological claim. Like Christianity is an essential thing that the culture just happens to be on top of, but it's unchanging underneath. And that's what's behind, I think, often the rhetoric is fake stuff. I tend to think, well, how else does anybody think? I mean, I was a debater in high school. I was a first negative. And if you look, I've made this joke before, but if you look at every single peer-reviewed article I have ever published, it is a first negative constructive speech. It is, here's what you think, here's what's wrong with it, let's move on. I mean, here's what's inherent in what it's embarrassing that I follow the same pattern that I learned when I was, 13 through 18, but it's deep. It is very deep in me now.
Yeah, and it's really kind of understanding, especially like as a modern scholar, right? I'm trying to think back and kind of trying to think through this lens of, these devices with or without, how are they used for and against? And so that really kind of helped clear that up a little bit. So just turning a little bit more towards something you mentioned, someone from the audience has asked a little bit more about the institutional contexts or forms in which these educations took place. Maybe, were they en masse? Were they, more privatized?
Absolutely privatized and available to you when you had money. So part of the intensive parenting of the ancient world was finding the right teacher, finding the most expensive teacher, often sending your child to another city to go to the best teacher, a teacher with whom you might have had connections in some way. And that teacher could accept you or not. By the time you get out to the 5th and 6th century, this gets to be even so formalized as to have the students of teachers be kind of groups that try to recruit for their teacher new students, because students mean money. So it is a private tutorial system, but so there's no single institution, like the, what would be the institute? I think of the NCAA for sports in universities, but I'm trying, like the AAUP or any other university-wide, the North Central accreditation system for high schools. Like there's no, empire-wide single institution. It's just everybody agrees this needs to happen. It is what makes you successful if you're trying to have a speaking or writing career, or it's a career that is based on speaking or writing. And so your parents try to get you into a place. Your parents or relatives or caretakers try to get you into the right teacher.
Okay,
It's a climbing situation. It is absolutely a climbing situation.
okay, that's really interesting. And so I'm gonna turn gears a little bit. Someone's kind of asked and are trying to connect what we've talked about here to, I think, their research. So someone has asked, I've been thinking lately about potential connections between development of the saints cult and celebrating saints days corporately in the late antique church in this rhetorical training. Have you
Yeah.
seen anything to suggest this, or can you speak a little bit more about it generally?
Well, okay, so I'll say two things about that. When I look at saints' lives, I see narrative everywhere. I also see lots and lots of anecdote or crea. So, especially things like the sayings of the Desert Fathers are simply collections of crea. I mean, that's what they are. This wise person said this thing. In terms of ritual, that is a place, like the ritual life of Christianity, rather than say the speaking and writing life of Christianity, is a place where these forms don't seem to appear. That is, I would love if an audience member thought, no, Ellen, they really do. But I look at that and I think that is an institution that is running on a parallel track, but it is something that is different and not formed by this, in part because Christians are learning to participate in ritual, especially in the early part of late antiquity. Most of them are learning as adults rather than as children. There's writers talk a lot more about adult converts or people who are becoming catechumens and sort of learning, and that's a process that doesn't seem to have a parallel in the rhetorical curriculum. So the kind of feast day, multitude, like 3 days of sermons about Thecla or that sort of thing, seems more tied to Roman feasting and celebrating institutions rather than Roman educational systems, right? So that's a place where rhetoric doesn't really, isn't as salient as, say, something like voluntary associations or graveside visiting or, family-based gatherings around the dead. That sort of thing is different.
Okay. And so I just want to make sure that I get all of our audience members' questions asked here. Someone else has asked, how do you think about the figures and tropes themselves across time? So I suppose the devices and space. Do you feel like the figures themselves are stable? How far through time might this stability extend? Yeah, that's a great question.
That is a great question. Like, are they, well, so, all right. One of the handbooks actually says that the progymnosmata are part of our nature as human beings, and learning them is just a matter of revealing them. So they're already within you, and they bring you out, rather than a earlier order thought of them as a stamp that got stamped onto you, and then you could reproduce from the stamp, like you had sort of like a printing press. You could kind of, not a printing press, obviously he didn't have that, but like a stamp that you could reproduce over and over again. In terms of whether they're consistent, that is a fascinating question. So speech and character is the one that I am most familiar with and that I study the most. And I think we often use it ourselves in our ethical reasoning. Now, am I out there making speeches like, well, you know, the guy down the street that I disagree with, what he'd say is, well, you're a young lady and you should be nice and be gender appropriate and all, you know. No, I don't actually do the speech, but I do reason, gosh, that guy probably thinks I should be more like a girl, and I should be nicer to him, and I shouldn't be so rude. Like, and I start to think what the other person is thinking based on that. So do the forms persist throughout time? Well, partially yes, because the literary system that we are a part of has continued to use them, but I think they represent certain ways of human thinking that I think are probably not just, you know, related to the rhetorical curriculum. Like, we imagine other people's thoughts about us, we mirror other people, we imitate them, we praise them, and we argue with them. You know, we have certain ways of doing things that these exercises represent, but they're peculiar enough and specific enough to be identifiable in late ancient literature.
Mhm, mhm. And so just so we have enough time to go through your slide and so you can explain everything on it, I'm going to make this question the last one. And it's a question that I have, and I'm kind of curious here. You know, a lot of times when employing these different types of exercises of rhetoric, you could run into logical flaws quite easily, right? Misstating someone's conclusion, you know, attacking the source of the argument. These things that we as scholars are really worried about in our own arguments. So is there any discussion of that in rhetorical curriculum or during this time period?
In the handbooks, there are discussions of correcting people. So, you know, correcting overstatements, especially in things like topos, correcting an overstatement. If I'm going to talk about farmers, I can't say all farmers wear white t-shirts and overalls. You know, I could, but then my teacher might be like, oh, you want to nuance that a little bit. But it's always it's a correction on a dial. It's not a light switch, you know, so most of the correction that they're imagining happening isn't, I've gotten this answer wrong, but rather I'm not yet quite attuned to what my teacher and the fellow students in my room want me to do. It's like a cultural attunement is probably the best phrase for it. So that kind of correction is the main correction that the handbooks talk about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. So we have 3 minutes left. Why don't we go ahead and pull up your slide and
Sorry that I forgot to do that.
No, not at all.
Yeah, but so like I said at the beginning, this is a topic about which I just love to think, and I'm happy to think about it with anybody on the call if they want to write to me later. I mentioned Raffaele Cribiori. This is just one book, Gymnastics of the Mind. She's written several books and articles about this system of learning. So if you're interested in seeing actual, especially if you're interested in seeing actual exercises done by students, like the kinds of sort of everyday papyri and everyday texts that we have, she's a great scholar to consult. George Kennedy is the person who took most of the handbooks, well, most of the Greek handbooks of rhetoric, and put them in a single, I actually have it here, put them in a single volume. So there's like a nice paperback, and each of those handbooks lists, you know, here's how you do this exercise, and here's one example or two examples. The rhetor Libanius of Antioch, who was a 4th century teacher of many people, John Chrysostom, John Chrysostom, let's see, I can't remember his other students, but a lot of people. He had a whole set of models that he published. So he published not a handbook, but here are like 15 models for how to do invective. Here's 15 more models on how to do topos. Two other people to look at, or two other resources to look at. Stanley Porter edited a volume that spreads far beyond late antiquity and far earlier, where he traces different kinds of descriptions of rhetorical education. And this is a resource if you're interested in the time before there were widespread handbooks for everybody to use. You know, when there's one or two people who are really setting the agenda, or as far as we can tell, setting the agenda. He's got excellent, it's a source book of sorts. So you can see primary source examples. And then Richard Flower and Rowena Ludlow a couple years ago did an edited volume called Rhetoric and Religious Identity in Late Antiquity. And it's a collection of essays from a whole bunch of different scholars, not just about Christianity, but most of them about Christianity and how rhetoric interacts with and forms and or doesn't form different parts of Christian culture. Now I'll stop sharing. There we go. Thank you for letting me do that at the end. I'm sorry that I didn't do it at the end of my talk.
No, not at all. That's what the whole purpose of the last 15, 20 minutes are. So you nailed it. But this brings us to the end of our time together. And I just again want to say thank you so much. That was such a phenomenal presentation. And I personally learned so much more than I even expected to. So thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Have a wonderful rest of your evenings, everyone. It's good to see. I can't see you, but it's good to see you anyways.
Yeah, and again, if anyone has questions, feel free to send an email. In the registration, your email should be there. If not, it's on your University of Michigan page, if I'm correct.
Yeah, yep.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all.